Roll 33/18218.
Barney on that camera?
Yes, it is. And Russell.
Gallipoli seems to have generated its own instant myths.
Yes, it did. In fact, so instant that it was a myth before anyone in Australia knew what had happened. The first telegram that told Australians that their men were in action simply said that they were in the Dardanelles and simply congratulated the Australians for their magnificent achievement and their outstanding success. And that was enough. A lot of Australians didn't know where the Dardanelles were, certainly didn't know where Gallipoli was. And if you look at the early newspapers, they're groping around to try and find where these places are, and they finish up publishing maps of the Middle East or something like that. So the events, in a way, didn't matter. It was an instant myth in that sense, yeah.
Was it a myth on the heights of Gallipoli, amongst the soldiers themselves?
Yeah, probably more slowly, ironically enough. As you know, the soldiers fought for the first week virtually non-stop, and they were too busy to think about what they were doing. They started to think about it first when they took a breather after a week of fighting, and then they tended to say, well, we've done all right, we've done all the right things and we've pulled it off. Later they got news for what the Australian papers were saying about them, and their reaction to that was, well, as usual, those papers have got it wrong. But, yeah, perhaps there is a more significance in what we're doing, and that is making Australia a nation and so on.
And were, in fact, the Anzacs as good as we think, as the papers said, as thought?
They were a very good division. The 1918 soldiers would be the most professional soldiers Australia's ever had, and perhaps talk about that. But they were very good. They'd had instilled to them that they should press forward no matter what happened, that if their officers were killed they should find another one and follow him, and that they should tell the rear what was going on. And they did that very well. In extraordinarily difficult conditions, they did it very well. So, allowing for the fact that they weren't professionals, they had every right to be proud of their performance. I should also point out, though, that there were very few Turks at the landing. There were probably 200 Turks opposed the initial landing of the Australians at Anzac. And of course they'd been got out of bed early, and if they're anything like me in that situation, they're not at their best. So the Turks also have very considerable reason to be proud of how effectively they resisted that landing. It's not only an Australian achievement, it was a Turkish achievement as well.
And not only an achievement of national importance to Australians, but also to the Turks.
Yes, there are three countries, all of them rural at that stage, which I think can base the beginnings of nationhood on that day and on that campaign: Australia, New Zealand and Turkey. And not only because Ataturk later became the president of Turkey and was at the landing on the Turkish side, but also because of the achievements of the Turkish soldiers in resisting this invasion. Gallipoli has considerable importance for Turkish nationalism.
I've read in your book a letter you quote of the Turks being respected because they played the game. They played the game of war. There's lots of people won't know this game that was played.
Yes. Well, it has a double-barreled meaning, of course. There's play the game in the British sense. Play up and play the game. Do the right thing. Play it according to the rules. And there was that sense. When the Australians said that of the Turks, they meant that. But that's not what they thought was most important about it. And the Turks demonstrated that.
Rolling. 298. Action.
Yeah, but there was more to it, wasn't there, than just playing the game hard, as far as the Australian soldier was concerned?
Yes, there certainly was. There was a myth that the Australians were living up to. Partly a myth they made themselves, partly one made for them during the war by people at home, and partly one that they'd inherited from the bush tradition in particular in Australia. For example, a mateship. Of course all armies make mates, and the Australians in both wars knew that better than any other Australians. They know very well about the quality of mateship. But the Australians made it an explanation for their behaviour, both in and out of the line.
Are they key part too, no doubt, of the Western Front?
Yes, possibly even more so on the Western Front. And so those immediate things like mates and the necessity of duty and so on were the things that kept Australians going in France.
And playing the game, did they take that same spirit through from Gallipoli to...
Not so much playing in the game in the light-hearted sense that you had on Gallipoli. And far too much
Initiative?
initiative, yes. The best example of that in the Australians, I suppose, would be the period of peaceful penetration in 1918. That was a period in which Australians individually were going out into German posts and capturing prisoners and blowing up posts and so on.
Following orders?
No, on their own account. Sometimes in ones or twos, sometimes in groups of 40 or 50, and sometimes up to battalion level, but clearly it began at the level of a private soldier. Now, they would explain that, and they have explained it by saying, well, it was easier to do it that way than to wait for the generals to order an attack, in which, you know, you'd have all the paraphernalia. This way we knock off the Germans and we're capturing as much ground. But they also saw that sort of thing as a peculiarly Australian way of behaving. It's something that they say they...
Thank you, Dave. Roll 32, slate 220. Single drill. And Russell.
Following orders?
Yes, following orders in some senses. It went on up to battalion level, but essentially it was something that private soldiers initiated and quite often did on their own account. You had groups of between 2 and up to 70 private soldiers or NCOs who went on their own account, and sometimes quite in an impromptu way would decide, oh, well, we'll go over and get a few prisoners today, or we'll go and see what's happening, and they'd come back with a few prisoners. And you had cases of an individual soldier who would go and capture 40 or 50 Germans and bring them back. And in fact, it provoked things like drawings of the drover, and there would be a single Australian soldier who brought back German prisoners from this time. Mind you, German morale was at a low ebb at this stage, understandably. And it was a very successful procedure. Peaceful penetration captured more ground than either the campaigns of the Australians on the Somme or the campaigns in Passchendaele, which cost so many thousands of casualties, captured much more ground than either of those. And the point about it is, in terms of myth, that only the Australians and the New Zealanders conducted that activity. And I think they did so, firstly because they thought it was easier than a set battle. They had more chance of surviving and more chance of succeeding. But B, because it suited their image as individualists, as heirs of the Bushmen, and as competent professional soldiers.
I have never heard this before. And it seems to me amazing that on the one hand you have the myth of Gallipoli, on the other hand this extraordinary story, unknown to all of us. How then does that compare with Kokoda?
Well, could I just say first that I'm not surprised that it's unknown in a way. Myths are made by civilians, soldiers.
Bill, can you just start that again? Just say, look to Russell and say, myths are made by civilians.
So you don't get a detailed knowledge of military performance informing the myth. A similar thing in Kokoda. Kokoda is part of the Anzac myth because it was such a crucial campaign to the safety of Australia, because of Damien Pere's excellent filming, and because the papers could point out the qualities of the Australian soldier in that campaign. It's an arena, like Gallipoli was, and therefore it lends itself to isolation by civilians.
Is it a valid myth?
Yes, I think it is. Of course, there are elements that are exaggerated. All myths are comprised of exaggeration. All myths have elements in them that aren't democratic. But it is a valid myth. There were some brave men on the Kokoda Trail, on both sides, I might add. In a way, the Japanese were unlucky not to succeed on Kokoda, and had the terrain been different, I have no doubt that they would have succeeded. But given that, the Australian soldiers who went in there knew that they were in for a tough time. They knew that the enemy they were opposing was much better trained, much more experienced in that sort of fighting than they were, and yet they went in and stood up in a way which I doubt I'd manage anyway.
I listen to you entranced and wonder whether Gallipoli, the Western Front, Kokoda are relevant today.
It depends what is derived from them. The great temptation of people in authority is to use those precedents as moral bludgeons to tell the young people how they should behave. These things were done in the past, therefore you should be good citizens. Now, if it's done in that way, I think, A, it's not useful, and B, it's actually an affront to the men who died and who fought. But if, as I would prefer to see, there's a realisation that the people who fought those campaigns were people next door, ordinary Australians, if you like. They've been mythologised, but they were ordinary Australians. And they spent their lives in what is essentially a fruitless purpose. We would have done much better to have those people still in Australia. If that sort of message is derived, then I think there is value from it. But let me also say that a country's going to have myths. All countries have myths. All myths have problems with them. None of them embrace everyone. The myth of the French storming the Bastille obviously doesn't embrace everyone. Not all Frenchmen storm the Bastille, but the French find it very useful. Australia too would find myths if it didn't have this one. The fact remains that Anzac is the most powerful myth that Australians in the 20th century anyway have been able to discern. And so the fact is it exists. Whether it continues to exist, another matter, of course.
Right. Good. 1234, slide 221.
One of the problems with the Anzac tradition, in fact the key problem, is that it doesn't offer a faith for the future. In the Anzac tradition, as in the bush tradition, Anzacs don't shape events, they are shaped for them. In both of those myths, man is small and events are enormous and overpowering. In the bush tradition, an admirable man can be wiped out in a drought. In the Anzac tradition, the bravest man in the RAF, probably Percy Black, gets killed before the wire at Bully Court. Doesn't matter what he's like, in a war or in the bush, you can just get snuffed out by a circumstance. And so they're accepting, they're fatalistic traditions, and for that reason they don't suggest to Australians how they might behave in the future. You can't make a prescription for the future out of saying to people, simply wait and see what happens. And that's the essence of both the bush and the Anzac tradition. And I think that will be their big problem in the future.
Excellent. Rolling, 222. That door will have to go back to divisional posse things. Not quite closed. About there. Yep. Okay. Russell.
I don't see the connection really between these things and empire.
Yes, of course, empire mattered to a lot of those soldiers. I mean, that's what they were fighting for and so on. And in their letters home, they often wrote about empire and civilization and so on. But I think really the myth is in two worlds for the soldiers. There's the world of war and the world of back home. And when they're writing letters, and therefore when we have most of their evidence about talking about empire and so on, they're really trying to connect back to that world. It's whether they're writing to mothers or wives, or whether they're consoling the next of kin of dead mates. They talk in the terms that they'd learnt to talk about. They learnt to console people by saying they died for their country, they died for the empire. So they did. But if you look at letters that they wrote to each other, they've dropped a lot of that. And if you ask them what they were doing in the front line and the bullets were whizzing around, they're not lying there saying, oh, I'm doing this for the empire. They're lying there saying, well, crikey, I hope that bloke besides, he helps me out. And I hope I get out of this alive, and I hope I get out of it, not maybe made a fool of myself. There's no empire in it then. And so you've really got two worlds. One, the world of the soldier, which is very immediate and very concerned, and two, how the soldier relates back to home. And then he starts to talk about the empire.
And cut. 223. Straighten up a bit, Russ. Not too much. And action.
You haven't said much about empire.
Yes. Well, when soldiers were writing home, they said a lot about empire, and I don't doubt to an extent they believed it. But really, when they're writing home, they're forming a bridge with another world. There's a world of the soldier in the front line, and there's a world of the relatives and the newspapers and so on back home. And when they're connecting with that other world back home, they think in terms that they learnt at home. So they talk about the empire and so on. But when they're writing to their mates, it's not like that. Or when they're talking to their mates, they have far more immediate concerns then. It's whether this bloke beside me will stick by me, whether I'll get this alive, and then perhaps a bit whether I'll get out of it without having made a fool of myself. They are the things that really matter. So there is a sense in which there's two sorts of myths going on. There's one supporting the empire myth at home, and there's two, what's going on in battle, where the empire really doesn't matter.
Good. Thank you. Well, thanks, Doug. 224. Single job. And action.
They set themselves high standards.
They certainly did, yes. what they thought of themselves, of their honour, mattered to them, and what they thought of their mates, what their mates thought of them, mattered to them. There was a saying in the first AIF of newly promoted second lieutenants, 1 pip, 1 week, meaning that somebody who's promoted was very likely to be very quickly killed. And the reason for that was that second lieutenants felt that they had to prove that they deserved to be officers, and so they took enormous risks. And there's some statistical evidence to show that being promoted from the ranks to second lieutenant was a lethal thing. And why it was because, whereas today somebody like me in that situation would have urgent business somewhere else, they thought, no, we must do the honourable thing, otherwise there's no point in living. We must be stand up by our standards and so on. I think in crisis situations that would still be the case. You get some of that sense in, say, firefighting, bushfires and that sort of thing, although I'm not so sure whether it would be as strong or as clearly defined as it was in the Great War.
Good. Okay. Ron.
225.
And says action.
Gallipoli seems to have generated its own instant myths.
Thank you. How's his fair feet?
226.
Just check. That's okay. Okay. Russ.
Gallipoli seems to have generated its own instant myths.
Yes, it did. As soon as the word got back to Australia.
Good. Thanks, Dan.
227.
So he's talking, action.
Was it a myth on the heights of Gallipoli amongst the soldiers themselves?
Oh, certainly it was, yes. It was one that I forged.
And good.
228.
And agree with him, yes, thank you, and action.
Was it a myth on the heights of Gallipoli amongst the soldiers themselves?
Oh, yes, it's certainly a myth they made. They adopted a lot.
To a close up, don't cut. Same question again, Russ. Action.
Was it a myth on the heights of Gallipoli amongst the soldiers themselves?
Yes, certainly it was.
Good. Excellent. Rolling.
230.
And yeah, also something.
And
Hang on. And action.
I suppose people have different ideas of the legend, but by and large, yes, I think they were.
Good cut. Thanks, Dave.
231.
Looking at him, Russ. Action.
and an achievement of importance not only to Australians and New Zealanders, but also to the Turks.
Certainly, yes. There were three nations who made traditions out of Anzac, Australia, New Zealand and Turkey.
Rolling.
232.
And set. Thanks, Russ.
And an achievement in national importance not only to...
Sorry, swallowed it and set.
And an achievement of national importance not only to Australia and New Zealand, but also to Turkey.
Oh, certainly, yeah. There were three nations that made a national tradition out of Anzac and the events on Gallipoli.
Yep.
233.
Action.
Apparently the Turks were respected because they played the game.
Yes. There's two senses in which you can play the game, of course. One is the British sense of play up and play the game.
Good cut.
234.
And set. Nice.
But there was more to it than just playing the game for Australian soldiers.
Yes, the Australians had several values of which they attached to.
Good cut.
235.
And set. And action.
And a key part too, no doubt, on the Western Front.
Certainly, the Western Front in many ways was more important than Anzac because of the greater number of soldiers who were there and the greater death rate and casualties.
Good. Rolling.
236.
Russ. Russ.
And to keep out too, no doubt, on the Western Front.
Oh, certainly. In fact, in many ways, the Western Front was more important than Anzac because of the game a bit.
Rolling. Thank you.
Yes, right.
237. Yes.
Did they take that?
Sorry, too quick. Action.
Did they take that same spirit of playing the game to the Western Front?
238.
And set. Action.
Initiative?
Once more, Russ.
Initiative?
Yes, that mattered.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's a little bit of amazement in following orders.
Yeah.
And 239.
And set. Action.
Following orders?
To an extent, but basically it began as a thing among private soldiers.
And rolling.
240.
And set. Action.
How does that compare with Kokoda?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I'm buggered if I know.
That's what we like to hear.
241.
And set. And action.
Is it a valid myth?
Once more.
Is it a valid myth?
I think so. Yes, of course it has its holes like all myths. They're
Good. Rolling.
242.
And set. And action.
Listening to you, I've been wondering whether Gallipoli, the Western Front, Kokoda are relevant to us today.
Well, there's one sense in which they're not relevant, of course. They celebrate wars, but there's another sense in which they're fought by Australians, and therefore...
Bill, if you just keep talking now, Pete, you just keep rolling. These are now cutaways, please, right?
And I take my hand away from
Yeah,
you.
do whatever you like.
Yeah,
So we're just shooting Russ, listening to you now, so you can rave on to him about anything.
yeah. Well, I have to cross that what I say doesn't make your face change too much.
Enough of that.
Yes, all right. Well, I'm sorry, I'm finding it a little difficult to think of anything serious, but let me continue talking about Kokoda. One of the things we were talking about before the other people came was this idea that the Japanese had such problems at Kokoda because they're narrow arena, and therefore they couldn't employ the typical flanking movements that you saw in Malaya and elsewhere.
Maybe arm on the table as a
I'm
gesture.
standing now.
Good.
And those sort of circumstances, I don't think really have done much to shape the myth. The myth really is about what Australians at home are interested in propagating. And they not only don't know about those sort of things, they're not really interested. They're interested in them. And that's been true since 1915, I think, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. How long am I going to have to go burbling on like this?
We'll give him a bit of a laugh now.
For
At one
what?
point when he laughed.
Well, I've run out of jokes. Could you manufacture a laugh? It's not possible. All right. Well, the fly's undone, and I don't know if they're going to pick that up.
Thanks, Chris.
243. Russ.
They set themselves high standards.
Yep, that's your
244.
set.
You haven't mentioned empire.
Well, of course, empire mattered to them, but there's a sense in which there's two worlds that the soldier moved in.